the history and evolution of punctuation marks in English. Punctuation saves lives. Consider this classic example. Let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma. One little comma turns a casual family meal into cannibalism. Yikes! These tiny marks may seem trivial, but they carry enormous weight in writing. Punctuation has a rich history, from ancient scholars first adding dots and strokes to break up text, to medieval monks inventing new symbols to aid reading aloud. Over the centuries, English writers gradually expanded and standardized the familiar marks we use today: commas, periods, question marks, and more. And the story isn't over. Even in modern times, new punctuation ideas, and even emojis, have emerged to convey tone and emotion that the old marks can't capture. In this video, we'll journey from ancient Greece to the age of texting, exploring how punctuation was invented, and how it changed, even nearly died out for some marks, and how it's evolving today, from the semicolon's decline to the rise of the emoji. Origins of punctuation, Antiquity to Middle Ages. Let's start at the very beginning. In the ancient world, writing was originally a wall of letters with no punctuation or even spaces. Early Greek and Latin texts ran together in continuous script, scriptio continua. Imagine reading a sentence with no breaks at all. Around the 5th century BC, Greek playwrights and orators began marking pauses at sentences to guide performers. A librarian named Aristophanes of Byzantium, 3rd century BC, introduced a clever system: dots placed at different heights to signify short, medium, and long pauses. A low dot indicated a brief pause, like a comma. A dot at middle height meant a longer pause or clause break, and a high dot signaled a full stop, essentially the ancestors of our comma, colon, and period. The Romans later adopted this Greek dot system, the Latin distinctionis, by the 4th century AD. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. As Christianity spread, monks copying manuscripts desperately needed ways to make texts readable, especially aloud. They started adding spaces between words, an innovation credited to Irish and Anglo-Saxon monks in the 7th and 8th centuries. And they developed new marks to clarify sentences. Medieval scribes used the pilcrow in margins to mark new paragraphs or sections. They used a dipple mark to denote quotations and a virgule to indicate a pause or breathing point in a sentence. In fact, the trusty slash was the workhorse punctuation of medieval Europe, doing the job of commas, periods, or any pause mark before those became standard. By the High Middle Ages, a more elaborate set of symbols, called possiturae, emerged in Latin writing. A punctus for a minor pause, like a short comma, a punctus elevatus, or similar, akin to a semicolon or a colon, for a medium pause, and even a punctus interrogativus for questions. That punctus interrogativus was basically an early question mark, described as a lightning bolt striking downward, before evolving into the curved question mark shape by the 13th century. In short, from antiquity through the Middle Ages, writers have invented punctuation to make reading clearer, transforming an unbroken string of letters into readable sentences with stops, pauses, and cues. The printing press and standardization. The next big leap came with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. Once books and pamphlets could be mass-produced, printers needed consistent punctuation rules to help readers navigate the text. In the late 1400s and into the 1500s, printers, especially in Venice, took charge of standardizing punctuation. The most famous was Aldus Manutius, a Venetian Renaissance printer who essentially shaped the system we use today. Aldus and his press introduced the semicolon, a brand new mark for a pause stronger than a comma but weaker than a period. They also transformed the old medieval slash by lowering it below the line. It evolved into our modern comma. Renaissance printers adopted periods, also called full stops, and colons, to mark full sentence breaks or strong pauses, and they used parentheses for asides. By 1566, Aldous' grandson could confidently write that the main purpose of punctuation was to clarify grammar and sentence structure, reflecting how organized and rule-bound punctuation had become. During the 16th and 17th centuries, English printers also picked up new marks that had been creeping in during medieval times, the question mark and exclamation mark. Both of these have colorful origin stories. The question mark is often said to come from scribes writing the Latin word quaestio, meaning question, at the end of a question. They'd scribble it as QO, with the Q on top of the O, and over time that morphed into our familiar question mark shape. Similarly, the exclamation mark is thought to originate from the Latin exclamation of joy, I-O, meaning hooray. Medieval writers wrote the I above the O, and eventually this stack evolved into a single vertical line over a dot. Voila! Exclamation point. By the late 1400s, an Italian scholar was advocating for this punctus admiratuus, excitement mark, to better convey emotion in writing. And soon the exclamation point found its way into printed books to denote surprise or strong feeling. Thanks to the printing press era, by 1700 or so, the core punctuation marks we all use had been defined and mostly standardized. The comma, period, semicolon, question mark, colon, exclamation mark, quotation marks, apostrophe, dash, and so on. English writing now had a common punctuation toolkit, and printers and writers used these marks in increasingly uniform ways. The Golden Age of Punctuation. By the 1700s and the 1800s, English punctuation had entered a golden age of codification. The system of marks was largely set, and people were taught very strict rules for using them. In fact, schools taught punctuation as a hierarchy of pauses. An oft-quoted 19th century verse instructed, "At every comma, stop while one you count. At semicolon, count to 2. At colon, count to 3. At a period, count to 4. This little line shows how seriously Victorians treated commas and company. Each mark had a precise length of pause when reading aloud. Punctuation was seen as essential for clarity. A famous anecdote from an 1885 printing manual illustrates this dramatically. Charles first walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off. Huh? As written, that sentence is nonsensical. Poor Charles. But add a semicolon and a comma. Charles first walked and talked. Half an hour after, his head was cut off. And suddenly, it makes perfect sense. The only difference is punctuation. Such examples drove home the point that using the right marks can completely change meaning. By the end of the 19th century, writers and printers had truly mastered the core punctuation toolkit, and usage conventions were fairly standardized. Nearly every mark we still use was firmly in place, and everyone agreed more or less on how to use them. In this era, punctuation wasn't just about pauses anymore. It was about precision and nuance in written language. Lost and unusual punctuation marks. Not all punctuation marks we invented stood the test of time. The 18th and 19th centuries, and beyond, saw many odd punctuation proposals that tried to add nuance, most of which faded into obscurity. For example, in 1580, an English printer named Henry Denham proposed the percontation point, a reversed question mark intended for rhetorical questions you aren't expecting an answer to. For a few decades, writers actually used the percontation at the end of rhetorical questions, but it fell out of fashion by the early 1600s. The idea of special marks for irony or sarcasm also tempted authors. In the 19th century, French poet Alcantar de Brême suggested a small irony mark, essentially a little elevated backwards question mark to signal when a sentence was meant to be tongue-in-cheek. He wasn't the last. Over the years, others have floated many irony marks, but none have really caught on broadly. In 1962, an American ad executive, Martin K. Spector, introduced the interrobang, a single glyph combining a question mark and an exclamation point for exclamatory questions or surprised disbelief. The interrobang enjoyed a flash of popularity in the 1960s. Some typewriters even had an interrobang key, but it too remained a niche novelty. These lost punctuation marks are fascinating footnotes. They show how writers have always looked for new ways to express tone and subtlety, like sarcasm or rhetorical emphasis, in writing. Most of these inventions didn't survive, but they paved the way for the next innovations, and they make great trivia today. 20th century, less is more. The decline of punctuation in modern writing. Moving into the 20th century, punctuation use began to shift with changing writing styles. Large-scale analysis of English writing shows that punctuation appears on average about 9 times per 100 words of text. But the way those marks are used has changed significantly over the last 100 years. The clearest trend, writers move towards lighter punctuation and shorter sentences. In the 19th century, long, winding sentences full of commas were common. In the 20th century, styles changed. People favored shorter, snappier sentences, which means more periods marking full stops and fewer commas within lengthy clauses. Essentially, modern writers started breaking up what could have been one big comma-filled sentence into 2 or 3 smaller sentences, each ending in a period. As a result, the comma, once ubiquitous, saw a steady decline in frequency, while the period became even more dominant. Linguists note that in earlier centuries, commas often served as a rhetorical or breathing function. You'd sprinkle them when you might pause when speaking. Today, punctuation is used for more strict syntax. We only put commas where grammar demands, not just wherever a pause feels right. The upshot? Modern prose has a cleaner, leaner punctuation style compared to that of the flowery, pause-laden writing of the 1800s. Winners and losers. Punctuation trends over the last 100 years. Zooming in further, we can see specific punctuation marks rising or falling in popularity throughout the 20th century. One big loser was the semicolon. The semicolon was a darling of Victorian and academic prose, useful for linking complex clauses, but in the past 100 years, writers have used it less and less. Data from historical corpora shows a dramatic semicolon decline. One study noted that in fiction, the semicolon's frequency dropped by over 50% after 1950, reaching as low as 1 semicolon per 1,000 words in the 2010s. In other words, where older text may have had semicolons fairly often, modern writing treats them as almost an endangered species. By contrast, the colon saw a resurgence. Since about the mid-1800s, and especially into recent decades, colons have been used more frequently. Often to do jobs that semicolons used to do. Writers now tend to use a colon to introduce an explanation, or to list, where old-school writers may have chosen a semicolon. In essence, the colon picked up some slack as the semicolon fell out of favor. Then we have the hyphen. Hyphen usage surged in the modern era, largely because of an explosion of hyphenated compound words. Think of terms like state-of-the-art or low-calorie, which became common as we created new compound descriptors. In journalism and technical writing especially, hyphens are everywhere, stringing words together into new concepts. Similarly, the apostrophe became even more common in the 20th century. Why? English speakers started using way more contractions. In formal 19th century writing, one might write do not or cannot, but in the 21st century, it's usually don't and can't. All those apostrophe marks in don't, can't, we're, I'm really add up. One analysis of internet text even found that while casual texting often omits apostrophes, on major platforms like Twitter, people still use them in 94 to 97% of instances where they technically belong. Meaning, even online, we're quite faithful in using our apostrophes. In summary, over the last 100 years, commas and semicolons have steadily declined in use, whereas periods, colons, hyphens, and apostrophes have all increased. English sentences became shorter, hence more full-stop periods per paragraph, and punctuation marks now skew more towards clarifying grammar, like colons and apostrophes, rather than decorating elaborate sentences, like those semicolon-linked clauses of old. The emoji era, a new kind of punctuation. As we enter the 21st century, a whole new set of symbols has joined our punctuation party: emojis. In a sense, emojis serve as a form of punctuation for emotion and tone in digital communication. The idea actually started earlier with emoticons, those smiley and frown faces made out of punctuation marks. For example, the colon, dash, and parentheses for a smile, or the semicolon, dash, and parentheses for winking. In the 1900s and early 2000s, people added emoticons to emails and texts as an emotional shorthand, literally using existing punctuation characters to sketch out a feeling. But around the late 2000s and early 2010s, emojis, graphical icons, became widely available on phones and social media, and they exploded in popularity. Suddenly, we had a whole palette of tiny pictures to complement our sentences, from the heart to the thumbs up. By the mid-2010s, studies found that roughly 50% of all Instagram comments included at least one emoji. And as of the early 2020s, roughly 1 in 5 tweets contain an emoji. On Facebook Messenger, people send over 5 billion emojis per day. These numbers are astounding. They show that emoji have quickly become a de facto part of written communication. In many ways, an emoji at the end of a message functions like punctuation with feeling. It can soften a statement, indicate humor or sarcasm, or add excitement that a plain period just can't convey. Essentially, we've created an emotional punctuation toolkit with these little icons. And emoji usage keeps evolving year by year, much faster than old punctuation ever did. For example, for a long time the reigning champion of emojis was the face with tears of joy, that laughing so hard I'm crying face. It was so widely used that it was even named the Oxford Word of the Year in 2015, effectively the laugh out loud punctuation mark of the internet. But by around 2020, a generational shift occurred. Many younger users started using the loudly crying face, the sobbing face, to signify intense laughter, as in, I'm dying laughing, ironically repurposing a crying emoji to mean this is hilarious. This trend actually dethroned as the most used emoji in some datasets by 2021. It's a subtle but fascinating evolution. The symbol for laughter changed as internet culture evolved. New emojis also rise with cultural moments. The pleading puppy eyes face, introduced in 2018, skyrocketed into the top ranks because people loved using it for pretty please or cute beseeching emotions. And real-world events can spike certain emoji uses. For instance, the syringe symbol emoji saw a huge jump during the COVID-19 vaccine rollout in 2021, as everyone was suddenly talking about vaccines. In short, emoji have become an extension of punctuation, one that's vividly tied to our emotions and pop culture. They show how our tools for expression keep expanding beyond the old commas and periods. Punctuation today: texting, social media, and AI. In modern times, where and how we write has a huge impact on punctuation style. Consider the differences between a casual text message, a printed novel, and even an AI-generated paragraph. Informal digital communication, texting, chats, tweets, has developed its own loose pronunciation norms. In a quick text to a friend, people often omit the final period altogether, ending a message with nothing, or just an emoji. One study of college text messages found that only about 29% of one-sentence text ended with a period at all. In fact, using a full stop in the short "okay" period text can come across as abrupt or even snippy, as if you're being overly formal or upset. Instead, texters rely on line breaks or just send the message without a period to keep the tone friendly. When punctuation is used in casual messaging, it's often exaggerated for effect. "Oh my god!" Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Multiple exclamation points for excitement. Or "what?" ... question mark. Ellipses show confusion or hesitation. Or "are you coming?" Question mark, question mark, question mark. Question marks piled on for urgency. These non-standard uses, linguists call them textisms, aren't bad grammar. They're clever tone indicators that compensate for the lack of voice tone or facial expressions in text. A triple exclamation point is like laughing or shouting in excitement, and a question mark exclamation point combo can convey disbelief. Emoticons and emojis, as we discussed, further augment or even replace punctuation in casual text. A laughing emoji can replace the need to say "ha ha," and so on. In short, internet and mobile communication tends toward a mix of minimalist punctuation for brevity and creative punctuation for emotion, rather than the rigid grammar of formal writing. Now, contrast that with published formal writing, say literature or academic prose. Traditional print genres still follow standard punctuation rules carefully, but each type of writing has its quirks. Academic writing, for example, tends to use fewer sentence-ending punctuation marks overall, because academic sentences are often long and complex, but uses more internal punctuation like commas, semicolons, and especially parentheses for all those asides and citations. One study found that academic articles had the fewest periods and exclamation points per sentence, but the most semicolons and parentheses, reflecting that academic style loves complex, nuanced statements with lots of qualifying clauses. Fiction, on the other hand, has the highest frequency of periods. Novelists often write in short, punchy sentences to drive the narrative, especially in modern fiction. Fiction might include the occasional exclamation or ellipses in dialogue, but nowhere near the level of a casual text or tweet. Journalism, news articles, fall in between formal and casual. Journalists favor clear, concise sentences, so plenty of periods, moderate commas, and make heavy use of hyphens to form compound descriptors, like policy-making body. But generally, they avoid the flamboyant stuff. You won't see 3 exclamation points in the New York Times, for instance. Overall, formal writing sticks to a balance of clarity and formality. Every sentence in print is expected to end with proper punctuation, no dropping the period, and emotional punctuation, like exclamation points, is used sparingly outside of dialogue or special context. Finally, let's look at AI-generated text, like something written by a large language model, say ChatGPT. AI systems are trained on huge amounts of writing, so they generally learn the standard punctuation conventions of formal written English. In fact, AI text often comes across as overly correct or even a bit stiff in its punctuation. Recent analysis comparing human writing to AI writing found some subtle differences. For instance, in certain tests, human writers used more question marks, dashes, parentheses, semicolons, and colons than the AI did. The AI, by contrast, stuck to simpler sentence structures, more straightforward periods and commas, and it tended to use quotation marks in a very literal way, like always using straight quotes for quotes or phrases, rather than peppering text with other punctuation flourishes. It seems AI avoids some of the stylistic punctuation that humans might throw in for flair. For example, human writers sometimes start a sentence with a dash for emphasis, like this, or use ellipses for effect, or toss in a question mark exclamation point for surprise. The AI also tends to avoid semicolon-heavy sentences or excessive parenthetical asides, likely because those longer, more complex constructions are harder to manage and not as common in its training data. And you'll almost never see an AI overusing exclamation points. Models are typically trained on a lot of neutral-toned text, think encyclopedias, books, etc., so they use exclamation marks very sparingly, if at all, unless you prompt them to be excited. In informal modes, like if you ask an AI to roleplay a chatty style, it can sprinkle in a triple exclamation point, or even an emoji if instructed, but by default it's much more reserved. In fact, the very absence of quirky or inconsistent punctuation is often a giveaway that something was written by AI. A perfectly punctuated, grammatically pristine paragraph with no ums, no ellipses, no odd capitalization, almost too uniform, might feel more robotic than a human's naturally imperfect writing. Some AI detectors even flag texts that lack any contractions or that never use an exclamation or emoji as likely AI because humans usually have at least some of those lively quirks. The irony is that to seem more human, AIs may need to loosen up their punctuation a bit. For now, though, most AI-generated English is conservative, lots of periods and commas in the right places, and not many triple exclamation points or quotes or question mark exclamation point eccentricity. It's grammatical and correct, almost too correct sometimes, which shows just how distinctive our human punctuation habits really are. Conclusion. From ancient scrolls with no breaks to instant messages full of smiley faces and hearts, the evolution of punctuation in English is a story of adapting to our communication needs. We invented marks to add clarity and emotion to writing, whether it was a monk in medieval times making scripture easier to read, or a teen texting a friend adding a triple exclamation mark to show excitement. Punctuation has never been static. It changes as our language and technology change. Some marks, like the trusty comma and period, remain indispensable, while others, like the semicolon, rise and fall with the trends. And entirely new symbols, from the interrobang to the emoji, keep entering the scene when we find a gap to fill. Even AI, the newest author on the block, is part of the evolution. And it might develop its own punctuation style as it learns to sound more human. The bottom line, writing is alive. Those little dots, dashes, and smiley faces aren't just decoration. They're tools that writers and readers constantly renegotiate to make written language as rich as spoken communication. The history of punctuation is still being written, one mark at a time. Who knows what punctuation or emoji will invent next? One thing is for sure, as long as we have something to say, we'll keep tinkering with how we write it down so that the meaning and tone shines through. The dance between language and punctuation goes on, and we're all a part of it. Every time we hit a period or choose a over a,